Welcome to the Andrew Holland Podcast, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Now, here's your host, Andrew Holland.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Holland. I'm a businessman, I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm a CPA that's worked in the investment and financial services industries. I've also started multiple companies that have achieved millions of dollars in revenue, and I've sold companies with multi-million-dollar valuations. You can find out more about my background at our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. Follow me on Twitter, Holland Podcast, to join us in conversations that we have every week outside of the podcast. Lastly, subscribe to our YouTube channel, the Andrew Holland Podcast. That way you can get updates every week when we post the video version of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us each and every Wednesday to talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. This week, I want to lay the groundwork, the foundation, so to speak, for a series of episodes where we'll focus on the importance and the application of personality traits and talents. Those two concepts can make a small business, medium sized business, and quite frankly, just individual personal lives successful or utter failures. And what I mean by that is having an understanding, number one, what the difference between personality traits and talents are. They're very interconnected, but they're very different. And then once you've identified the difference between those, how can you use that knowledge to foster your own personal growth, to build dynamic teams that are effective, and to create, or I should say, achieve strategic objectives within an organization. Once you or identify the difference, but also realize the importance of those, and we'll discuss this starting today, just really the difference between the two, what they are. And then in future podcasts, we'll kind of talk about personal growth. And then we'll talk about building teams using these concepts. How can you use them to build teams? And then lastly, how can we utilize those concepts to achieve corporate objectives, small business objectives, any type of mission that you want to achieve? And just like so many of the topics that we talk about, not only is this incredibly relevant in the professional world in business, but it's also very applicable in our own personal lives. So, when we talk about personality traits and when we talk about talents, what do we mean by that? So, personality traits are really enduring patterns of thoughts or feelings, behaviors that shape a person's overall character, and they really have an impact or influence how they interact with other individuals and how they perceive the world. I would say that over time, personality traits are far more stable and consistent. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have a personality trait that you can't, let's say a personality trait that you identify as a weakness. That doesn't mean if you identified it that you can't work on mitigating that personality trait. And the reason it's so important to understand a trait versus a talent is because we all have skills and capabilities. That's more of a talent. But we're also, and this is where we get into nature versus nurture, born with certain general tendencies. And that is really the definition of what a personality trait is. Now, certainly, and we've seen this through many cases throughout history, and of course, I'm sure all of in our personal lives, we can identify nurture type scenarios where perhaps traits were exacerbated because of an environment in which someone grew up in. That's the nurture side of the argument. But then there's also the nature, which is just who we are genetically. what's been passed down in our lineage. I think that a lot of times as business owners, we forget that when you're hiring or when you're thinking about going into business, doing an analysis and understanding, let's focus inwardly right now on our own traits versus our talents is such a key aspect of building a foundation or giving yourself the highest probability for success. And that goes with building a company, building teams. It's also really important when you think about customer service because really all business is a group of humans interacting with each other, often one providing a good or a service to another that they find valuable and that they're willing to pay for. So if that's all business is, and just like everything in life, it's all about relationships. But if that's all business is, humans working together and interacting together, it would stand to reason that focusing on what makes a human who they are, their personality traits, and why do they do the things they do, why do they have the general tendencies that they have, focusing on that should be high on your priority list at any stage of the game, whether you're thinking about going into business, whether you're already in business, when you're trying to build teams, whether you're looking to sell, who's a good personality fit for your existing company. It's pretty much ubiquitous in terms of its importance. Now, let's contrast that with talents. The difference may seem subtle, but there is a big difference. And when you're doing some of the analysis that we've talked about, again, personal growth, building teams, making sure that you're putting the right people for the right job so that you can accomplish strategic objectives, understanding the difference of those two is step number one. And then being able to identify within each of those categories what are some of the traits is also going to be important in setting yourself up for success. So, talking about talents, talents really refer to innate or developed abilities, aptitudes, skills that one possess in specific areas. If you're familiar with one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, he talks about becoming an expert requires 10,000 hours. And when he's talking about that, that's really about developing and honing a specific talent as opposed to personality traits, which, as we just described, are often enduring and stable over time. It's much harder to change. And I would argue you can't change them, but you can mitigate them if they're things that are, or personality traits that are weaknesses. And we all have strengths and weaknesses, both from a trait perspective and from a talent perspective. But focusing on talents, those are areas where we choose to apply ourselves and develop or hone a specific skill. They're very flexible. They can be accentuated with effort and they can be altered over time. That's the concept of having 10,000 hours before you become an expert, whether it's playing the piano, whether it's playing basketball, whether it's running businesses. There are certain things that we as individuals, both personally and professionally, spend our time doing. And oftentimes, the whether it's a hobby or the things that we spend the majority of our time doing, we start to hone and develop specific talents or skill sets that lend themselves well in certain areas and maybe not in other areas. And that's the other interesting thing about talents. They're often very domain specific. They're focused in one area. We've heard jack of all trades, master of none. That phrase is really talking about where have you chosen to focus your efforts on creating talents. And if you try to spread yourself too thin and you're trying to do so many things and across so many different domains, you're not really going to have the opportunity to have, again, using Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour concept, to hone in a specific talent and really perfect it. You kind of have you get halfway with a whole bunch of talents. And usually that doesn't lend itself well for success in business. Not to say that you can't be multifaceted, and not that to say that you can't have more than one talent. But when you think about some of the most famous individuals, Louis Armstrong, what was he incredibly talented at? Michael Jordan, what was he incredibly talented at? Go Muhammad Ali, what was he incredibly talented? We think about one thing. We think about one specific skill set that that individual had that they worked at and worked at and worked at and practiced, completely separate from what was their personality. What were their natural tendencies that were established either from nature or accentuated or developed, although traits, again, aren't something that you specifically develop through nurture. And so I think when we're talking about traits versus talents, and when you're thinking about why should I care, for those of you who have been in business, and for those of you who have had employees, and for those of you who have excelled in customer service, you've likely experienced that being able to understand the difference between those two things and how you react based on varying personality traits and based on how you organize people based on their different talents can result in largely different outcomes. So, what are some examples of personality traits? I think we can think of extrovert versus introvert. That's a very common concept that would generally fall under personality traits. Extroverts are generally outgoing, they get more energy by being around crowds, whereas introverts are more introspective, they like being alone. Being around crowds is exhausting for them. Those are really personality traits and not things you can particularly change about yourself. That doesn't mean that introverts can't be successful in social settings. It may mean that they just have to work a lot harder to be able to accomplish the things they want to accomplish if it requires being an extrovert. And our society tends to have a strong infatuation with extroverts. When you look at the most flamboyant CEOs or most outspoken CEOs, they're typically extroverts. And that brings us to an interesting concept of what type of personality traits work the best in varying positions: CEO, CFO, manager. Those are, of course, corporate terms, and you can apply them in small business as well. But it gives us a framework upon which to think about, okay, if I'm hiring for a particular role, before I put something out there, what type of individual do I see would be successful in this role? Set aside the talents, but to their core, what traits, personality traits, do I want this individual to exhibit? Other examples would be agreeableness versus maybe a little bit less agreeable, conscientiousness, openness to try new things versus kind of stuck in your ways and less dynamic. And then I think the last one, and this is one that is so crucial in this day and age, and that I think has been most impacted by technology, is emotional stability. That is one that I think another term for it, I should say, is emotional intelligence. That one is or requires such a huge level of focus in this day and age because, generally speaking, in my experiences, and I'd love to hear your experiences as listeners, send a tweet to me, A Holland Podcast, or shoot me an email on our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. I tend to see that the stability of human emotions as technology has proliferated has gotten worse. And again, this is a personal belief that this technology has given us everything we want in such a quick period of time. We can look up anything, we can go anywhere, we can really do anything we want, that it has actually altered the way our mind works and our ability to deal with conflict and our ability to control our emotions. I think for the younger generations who have really grown up with iPhones and things like Facebook and Twitter and TikTok and Instagram, I think that's an even bigger problem because, and we've talked about this in previous podcasts, they're constantly comparing themselves. And that can really cause some emotional volatility, especially during some of the most formative years, the teenage years. But a little bit of a digression there. That's something as it relates to a personality trait. Some people are just inherently more emotionally stable, and other people are maybe a little bit more volatile. And that may be reflected whether it's, quick to anger or not quick to anger. That would be an example potentially of emotional stability. I think the other thing that's important to recognize when you're talking about traits is if you try to put someone in a position that requires a certain set of traits, but they don't necessarily exhibit those traits. And not that every single position can be broken down exclusively into, okay, this person needs to be an extrovert, this person needs to be open to varying experiences, this person is going to pick whatever traits you want, be generally understanding. But oftentimes, in my experience, you usually can boil a position down to some key aspects or traits. And again, in my experience, if you hire someone for a specific position that does not exhibit those traits, set talent aside right now. We're talking about traits, just the natural tendency of an individual. It's not to say that they can't be successful, but the amount of effort and energy that it's going to take for them to be successful, taking an introvert and putting them into a sales job, is vastly greater than if you matched up someone's traits with the traits that would give them that would match what the roles and responsibilities of that position are. A sales position, as I just used, is a really easy one. You don't want someone that's an introvert, generally speaking, in a sales position. That's one where you have to cold call, you have to be very outward focused, you have to be very socially involved. And so, if you put an introvert into that position, they're likely going to struggle. Not to say that there aren't successful salespeople whose natural tendency is introversion, but I can tell you that if they are successful, they're probably putting a lot more work and effort, and that can create a tremendous amount of exhaustion. If we jump now to talents, this one's pretty easy in the sense that if you want someone to be a bricklayer, you want a skilled laborer who's laid bricks before. That's something that they've done a lot, they've honed that expertise, and they're great at it. Now, probably anybody can be a bricklayer. They just need to do it for an extended period of time. They need to practice. A common adage, of course, as we all have heard, practice makes perfect. That's focused on this concept of talents. You don't want to put someone in a role or responsibility who is expected to already have developed a particular skill and they haven't had the opportunity to do so. Now, I said that traits and talents are interconnected, and that's very true. What we tend to see is that oftentimes a certain set of traits matches up with certain talents. Perfect example. If you're someone that's an extrovert, that's what I would consider myself, generally an extrovert. I love being around people. Not to say that sometimes you don't get exhausted in huge social settings, but I love being around people. I love learning from other people, hearing what they have to say. That energizes me. On the contrary, if I don't get that social interaction, whether personally or professionally, that can get somewhat depressing because an extrovert that's fuel for me. Complete opposite of an introvert. Now that trait typically lends itself well to something like a podcast host or public speaking or a sales position where you need that trait. And so not everybody is naturally gifted at public speaking, but that's a talent that can be developed. And so if you have someone who's an extrovert and they work on being a public speaker, that trait and that talent typically go hand in hand very, very well. I could go on and give a whole bunch of additional examples, but I think you get the idea of what is a trait, really can't be altered to a large degree, and what is a talent, and how do you develop or hone that? And why are those two things incredibly important? Now, I want to take a step back and I want to ask you a few questions about yourself. If you had to write out or email to me what your personality traits are, would you be able to? Have you done enough introspection, self reflection, being honest with yourself about what your traits are? Now, there are what I would consider generally positive personality traits, and then there are personality traits that you will struggle with and that generally cause or are tendencies that are viewed as negative and make things more challenging for you. Just like with talents, you can have strengths in certain areas and weaknesses in other areas. And a perfect example for me is, as I've said in the past, in my brother and I own a construction company. My personality traits lend themselves well to a certain aspect of the business, the customer relations, the office side of things, as I'm a CPA, but not as well to the actual on the job work. Now, I do a lot of it, and I think it's important for every owner to understand every aspect of the business and at some point to work in every area of the business. And when you start something from scratch, that's often the case. You have many hats, and so you have to dabble in developing certain talents. But if you want to grow and you want to grow successfully, ultimately you get to the point as a business owner where you start having to delegate tasks to people who can take you to that next level because they've honed those talents. And then you can focus on the area within your organization that is most matched with your talents. And again, there's a combination or an interconnection between traits and talents. So, future podcasts, I want to delve into this topic more. And I guess I asked you the question, I said I wanted to ask you a few questions. Okay, what are your traits? Now, what are your talents? And as it relates to both of those things, be honest with yourself. You're not telling them to anybody else. You can certainly share them. If you're not sure what your personality traits are, and often when we're younger, we haven't lived enough, we haven't experienced enough maybe to know exactly who we are, what our natural tendencies are. And certainly as we grow older, we get a better idea of what those are because we live life, which often requires you to find out where your strengths and your weaknesses lie. And as you mature, you get the opportunity to decide where do you want to focus your talents and your efforts and what do you want to hone. So, if I wanted to get amazing at construction, for example, a talent that can be learned, I believe that I could. I believe that anybody could really accomplish any talent incredibly well if they put their mind to it. Now, having said that, as I've just said, developing a particular talent, public speaking, is likely going to take a lot less effort and work for an extrovert than it will for an introvert. And so you typically don't find introverts going into public speaking because, in order to develop and hone that talent and turn it into monetize it, really, if that's the goal, it would take double or triple the effort of someone that's just naturally inclined that way. And there's lots of examples, as I said, but that's one that's pretty basic and easy to understand. So if you haven't already done a self assessment and you haven't written down what are your traits versus what are your talents, do that. Do that before our next podcast so we can have additional conversations about once you've done that, how can you apply these concepts? I want you now to think about whether you work in the corporate world or you work for someone else or whether you own your own business. Think about the people within your team. Think about the people within your organization. Have you thought about what are their personality traits and what are their talents? That's important to understand, especially if you're in a management role, because if you have the wrong individuals in the wrong positions, not only are you not going to be able to achieve the outcomes that you want, but you're not setting them up for success. And the most successful organizations understand the importance of the human element, not just putting anybody in a role, but understanding who they are, what they're naturally inclined to, and then putting them in an area where they're going to have the opportunity to be the most successful. When I think about hiring, and this will be a whole podcast, talents less important to me. Personality traits far more important than anything. And why is that? Because as I said, personality traits are things that generally don't change over time. They're relatively stable. Talents, skills, anybody can be taught those things. And so I want you to think about, again, your teams, if you're working in a corporation or even in a small business. And step number one is identifying who your team members are and then their traits and their talents. And do that over the next week. So in our next episode, we can have a meaningful conversation about, okay, you've assessed yourself, you've assessed your team members. Now, what do you do with that information? Well, that's all the time we have for this week's episode. I know it's a little bit shorter, but I think this is such an important concept and one so frequently missed in this day and age that we're going to take this over the next few weeks, and we might have a few guests in between there, but over the next few podcasts, bit by bit, because the more time and attention we focus on this concept and the application of it, I think the more we're all going to benefit from what comes out of it. I want to hear from you, our listeners. This topic is a really important one. Have you run into conflicts or issues because maybe there was an assessment done on someone's personality traits or their talents, or the two are confused? Let me know. I want to share these things because this podcast is all about us collectively being a support group as business owners and entrepreneurs, because I know I've made a lot of mistakes when it comes to this concept and these categories. And if you have, I'd love to hear the mistakes that you made. If you found real success because you applied these concepts in certain areas, reach out to me, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. Shoot me an email. I want to hear it. Again, this podcast is only as good as we collectively make it. You can also shoot a tweet to me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @HollandPodcast. Remember, this is a podcast where sometimes we talk about legal and financial concepts. Don't ever take anything you hear on this podcast or any podcast for that matter as it relates to those specific topics and apply it to your situation without getting the appropriate legal and professional help for your specific needs. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk again next Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the Andrew Holland Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content on business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get notifications when new podcasts have been released. And lastly, follow us on Twitter, @Holland Podcast. That's @Holland Podcast for all the conversations we're having outside the podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us this week. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next week.